Imam, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum assalam. How you doing?
Alhamdulillah, looking forward to our conversation today. We've had the opportunity to go through some incredible arguments for God. And I think that we've created an incredibly robust case. But it's still important, I think, for us to acknowledge that there are certain arguments, certain contentions against the idea of God. And today I really wanted to hear your perspective on what I think is perhaps one of the most effective, the one that seems to cause so many folks to lose their faith. And I want to share it to you through a story, actually. I remember when I was in college, and one of the other brothers in the MSA, the Muslim Student Association, after a particular event, pulled me to the side and just wanted to have a conversation. A really brilliant brother, by the way, and he just wanted to hear my take on evolution. He wanted to hear my take on natural selection and filtration. And as the conversation went on, we talked for an extended period of time. As the conversation went on, it became clear to me through not only the things he was saying, but the passion with which he was saying them, that he had wholeheartedly accepted the theory of evolution, the premises, the conclusions, and therefore
Accepted it as an alternative to faith.
Exactly, accepted it as an alternative to faith, that it had removed the place for God in his life, in his mind, in his view of the world. And so I want to understand, offer me please your analysis. How serious of a threat is evolution to faith?
I have, by the way, come across many cases like the one you're describing, and I did not see in all of my years a perspective or a paradigm that caused people to lose their faith more than the theory of evolution. And so we definitely have to address the contentions of evolution and how evolution is understood. And when you think about it, I mean, there is a very good reason for people to lose their faith when they're exposed to evolution, or at least when they're exposed to the theory of evolution the wrong way. You have all these young people of faith, let's take this particular gentleman that you referred to in the story. I'm pretty sure this kid used to go to Sunday school and memorize the Quran.
Absolutely.
And has had religious parents, and perhaps even went to Islamic school for a number of years.
A good guy, honestly, like a really kind person.
I have no reason to doubt that or to question that. And someone like this was exposed to a particular understanding his entire life until he came across evolution for the first time. So, that person was taught that God exists, God created the universe, heaven and earth. There is an intentionality about God bringing to existence, different creation, different species. God sent Adam all the way from heaven down to this earth in order to, start this human civilization. A lot of people were actually taught erroneously that, there was nothing on earth before Adam, and it was an empty place, and so forth. And then God gave Adam, all this power and all this knowledge and so forth, and Adam became, the human being and the ancestor of all other human beings. Every species was created by a direct act and intention of God. And you see that in the scriptures, you see that in the Bible, you see that in the Quran and so forth. And then you go to college or you start reading about evolution for the first time, and suddenly the narrative is completely different. Suddenly it says that we all have a common ancestor. Suddenly it says that, it's been millions of years in the making, this gradual transformation that happens in the species, and that gave rise to, to life.
I think many people feel that they were lied to, perhaps, that they were taught one thing and that this is an explanation for everything in the world, and then they're exposed to it, like you said, in high school and later, in college as well sometimes, and it's more detailed, it's thorough, compared to their Sunday school understanding.
And it presumably fills covers the patches and fills the holes in our understanding. And if the process of life was not guided by the graceful hand of God, and it's all just this blind process of evolution, then who really needs God? Why did I waste my time all these years when this was just a myth?
So what is it that we need to do today? Do we need to tear down the theory? I think this is how many people of faith will respond. They'll say, we just need to take down the theory of
Can I
evolution.
make a disclaimer?
Yes, please.
I am an evolutionist.
You are an evolutionist.
I wholeheartedly subscribe to the theory of evolution, to Darwinism as a theory of science. And I think that what I will attempt today is two things. Number one, to demonstrate that our reading of the scriptures and our reading of the theory of evolution led to this entirely avoidable crash between religion and science. And number two, I will attempt to actually demonstrate that you can be a man of God, a man of faith, and perfectly subscribe to evolution, no ifs and buts.
I'm speaking to you, you serve as an imam in a community, yet you're telling me you're an evolutionist, and the conventional wisdom is that evolution and faith are not compatible. So are you telling me otherwise?
In this conversation, I will attempt to show that you can be both an evolutionist and a man of faith. There's no contradiction, at least in some readings of the scripture, all right? And those readings may not always be very traditional readings. And it's not in all faiths, by the way, and it's not in all scriptures. You know, I will show you that with particular faiths, with particular readings of particular scriptures, we should be able to develop a reconciliation between evolution and creation.
Okay, so some faiths, some readings, I think we need to get into this, but perhaps the first thing we need to do is to get into evolution itself. I feel that many folks who struggle with this incompatibility issue, I think they know about Darwin, they've heard about the origin of species, but really folks don't truly understand the theory, they don't understand exactly how it's laid out. So perhaps we can spend a little bit of time doing that first?
Yeah, and it's not really that complicated. I mean, Darwin, remember, you know, he propounded his theory in the later years of the 19th century. And so this is a fairly young theory. It's been around as a theory of science, been around for, you know, a little over 100 years.
Right.
And so in Darwin's, and of course so much has changed ever since Darwin, right? But in Darwin's own words, and I will simplify this as much as possible, that basically evolution is change. Evolution is cumulative change that happens within a species over millennia, over millions of years, over extended periods of time. And this change will lead to transformations that happen within the species itself, and it will also lead to the creation or the production of new species altogether, which is the process that was called speciation. And the mechanism by which this happens, you know, according to Darwin, is called natural selection, basically.
So you're talking not about small incremental changes, which I think we see, you know, if we observe, you know, nature over a few species, etc., and the reason why one animal is this color and that color. You're talking about drastic changes.
We're talking about massive changes over millions of years. We're talking about a common ancestor, and this common ancestor having offspring, and every offspring went in one direction and was subjected to all kinds of elements that led to the changes in the species and the production of new species in a manner that contributed to the biodiversity of our world.
So let's break this into maybe key features. What are the key features of evolution?
Number one, common ancestry.
Common ancestry.
Every single living being on this earth, according to evolution, traces its roots all the way back to a common ancestor.
So not the common ancestry of human beings, the common ancestry of all of life?
All of life, you know, and I know that for people with traditional religious knowledge, this sounds shocking, but according to the theory of evolution, we share a common ancestor, not just with primates, monkeys, apes. We also share a common ancestor with hippos. We share a common ancestor with squirrels, with fish, with whales, with reptiles, with bacteria, with viruses, with protozoa, with unicellular organisms. All of us come from one single unicellular organism.
Many people who attack evolution will say, what you're saying is that we come from monkeys, and that's not what common ancestry means.
That's not necessarily what evolution says. It says that both monkeys and us come from a common ancestor.
Right, and our ancestry diverged at some point
into these millions and millions and millions of different species that existed on Earth. Okay. So common ancestry is a foundational concept for evolution.
I think we understand common ancestry. What are the other key features?
Deep time, they call it, and we're not talking here about change or transformation over a couple of thousand years. We're talking about millions and millions of years. And so with these small incremental changes, given enough time, it will basically snowball into massive changes within the species itself or the production of a new species altogether.
Deep time seems fairly straightforward, and we can talk about the length of the time of the universe, time of Earth itself. I think we can understand that.
And how long life has been on Earth.
Right. But there are also two other, I think, features, right?
The third premise, I guess, of Darwinism or evolution is the mechanism.
Right.
The mechanism by which this process takes place. And like I said, Darwin, it was about like 120, 130 years ago, or maybe a little bit more. But Darwin, science at his time was not as developed as it was today. So Darwin looked at the fossil record and he basically used that to argue for natural selection.
Natural selection, the survival of the fittest.
Well, I mean, that's actually, sort of a colloquial way, an unscientific way of characterizing natural selection. It's not always the most powerful that survives, but, we can always talk about that.
Sure.
But, natural selection where species that have the most favorable qualities to survive are the ones that end up surviving. The ones that members of the species that do not possess those qualities will end up being, removed from the genetic pool, basically, and they will die out. Later, in the 20th century, the science of genetics was developed so extremely well, and every genetic finding, supported the findings and the premises and the hypotheses of Darwin, and now we added to those mechanisms the process of genetic mutations.
Oh, right.
So it's not just natural selection, it is also genetic mutations, and that is what we call neo-Darwinism. When we add genetic mutations to natural selection, so we keep common ancestry, we keep deep time, but we add this additional process of change that basically constitutes what we call today neo-Darwinism.
You call these the mechanisms. The first mechanism, natural selection, the idea that the species that has, or the members of the species that have particular traits that are advantageous in general or in a particular environment? In a particular
environment, in a particular locality. So take, for example, we're going to think of a habitat that has, white rats and black rats. And then there's hawks that feed off of those rats.
Right.
In wintertime, the white rats, because they're white, they will camouflage and they will be able to blend in the environment. And so the hawks will end up feeding off of the black rats. Over time, it will become advantageous. So nature basically selected white rats to survive and weeded black rats out. That is, there's also the giraffe example.
Yeah.
Giraffes with shorter necks were not able to reach, the leaves in higher branches, so they died out. And branches and giraffes with longer necks are the ones that survived. And so as they procreated, all the subsequent giraffes that came from those unions developed longer necks, and that's why giraffes have longer necks today. So this is basically the premise of natural selection.
And the length of the neck or the color of the mouse or things like this, they might come about through random mutations, right? This is the genetics aspect of it.
This is the genetic component, that as mitosis and meiosis take place, cell division process and stuff like that, tiny little microscopic changes happen in the DNA and so forth that lead to the development of new qualities and perhaps even new species over time. So you have natural selection and genetic mutation. In fact, genetic mutation contributes more to evolution, significantly more than natural selection.
See, I think there's got to be a trigger warning here, because now you said a phrase that's going to set people off. You said a new species, not just changes within the species, but brand new species altogether, not created by God and then sent to Earth, but that they came about through some process of the natural world.
And people of faith tend to be offended by statements like this, and I really think that it is more of us trying to fight battles that are not necessary to fight. I mean, you basically create your own war. And perhaps we'll talk about this, a little bit later. There is nothing in the scriptures that explicitly says that every single species was individually created by God's, creative agency in a direct fashion, right? That statement doesn't exist. But let me explain to you what Darwin said about speciation, because this is really an important component of evolution. So let's say that, there is a particular species of cats that lived, in a certain habitat. And then this massive earthquake, took place, split the entire colony of cats. And these are wild cats, right? They're not, little, Johnny that lives in your house as a pet.
Right.
These are wild cats that lived together in thousands and thousands and thousands. And so let's say that an earthquake came and split that area with this massive
chasm of some kind.
chasm, this massive canyon, and half of the colony was separated from the other half, right? And then, all kinds of, and they moved in two separate directions. They're still the same species, right? But they started eating different food, and they started, procreating under different circumstances. Genetic mutations took place differently in those two colonies. Over time, their colors are changing. Their wasps are getting longer or shorter, or whatever. Their ears are becoming, more accurate, or their sense of hearing became stronger. Whatever it is that will start happening over the centuries, literally maybe 60, 70, 100,000, 150, 500,000 years later, when you examine a member of those two colonies, they will be completely different species, meaning they cannot procreate. That's our definition of a species. Members of the same species can procreate together with each other. Once they come to a point where they look at each other weird, like, who is this? That's when we realize that we've reached, two different species.
Okay, so you did mention that we can examine what we might find in the scripture and what it actually says. But before we get there, I really feel like we need to see if evolution is actually as established as some may claim. I think people of faith will want to know that as well. How solid is the evidence really?
The evidence for evolution is so strong and so solid that it would be absolutely foolish to go against it. It would make us sound very unscientific and superstitious if we question valid and established science.
Evolution is a fact, it's just that it is?
Today it is considered the established biological theory of how life evolved, and it is the established biological theory that explains the biodiversity of our Earth. And we are, perhaps science changes all the time. Right? Okay. The evolution is a young theory, and it's been around for, like I said, less than 150 years.
Right.
500 years ago, we had a different explanation. 500 years from today, we will have a different explanation. Science continues to evolve. I think through this series and all these conversations, we've established that. We accept that. But as long as we cannot produce an alternative theory of science that is accepted and that is tested in the lab, that is falsifiable, then we have to accept this as the established science for now. And like I said, I will demonstrate to you that at least in some understanding of the scriptures, this is not incompatible with faith.
Tell me about the evidence specifically. What are we looking at and saying this is really robust? So
take, for example, the fossil record, which is extremely important in order for us to ascertain that evolution is correct.
Because this happened like millions of years ago. We weren't there.
We weren't there, but when we dig the earth, the deeper we dig, the older back in time we go. And so we would find fossils within a certain layer of the earth. All those fossils, when we undergo carbon dating, they all belong to the same evolutionary period, and they all belong to the same layer of the earth. The deeper we go, we realize that we are basically seeing the ancestors of those same species as we dig deeper and deeper and deeper. There has been not a single exception to that. We've never seen a dinosaur in the upper layers of the earth. We've never seen a rat in the lower layers of the earth. It has always been the younger species first, and then as you dig deeper, you get towards the older and older species, the ancestors of those same species, proving without any doubt the perspectives of Darwin.
So what the fossil record is telling us is that the predictions of evolution as a theory are accurate, and there has not been, there must have been a few exceptions in the fossil
There has
record?
been not a single exception. So all the predictions of Darwin actually, I shouldn't say all, most predictions of Darwin when it comes to the fossil record, like he would say, one day we will discover a fossil with these particular features in that particular layer. And then, 50 years later when we dig, we find it in Utah or Louisiana or somewhere in Africa. And so the fossil map is not complete, obviously, but it still has areas to be completed here and there. But so far, everything that we've discovered, reinforced the theory of evolution as a theory of science.
Tell me about certain creatures, they share features. Others have completely divergent features. How can this be evidence for evolution?
So when certain creatures, for example, have features that would make them look very different from other features, this is called the phenotype. So at face value, from the outside, when you look at a human being, mm-hmm. when you look at a whale, when you look at a dog, when you look at a squirrel, when you look at a bat,
right.
They look like they're very, very different creatures. But the science of homology, which is another very important evidence for evolution, suggests that actually, if you break it down to the skeletal level, if you look at the skeleton of the baby whale and the baby human being and the baby bat and the baby dog and the baby squirrel and the baby frog, they actually look, surprisingly identical. Which in the science of homology would suggest a common ancestor. So even if the whale is so big and the squirrel is so small, they're both mammals and they both actually trace their origin to a common ancestor, as reflected in how the skeletons of their babies may look like.
And you mentioned, by the way, earlier that genetics came forth and also it offered something for this conversation. Mm-hmm. Genetics is a science that developed after the predictions and ideas of Darwin and early evolution, and this serves as an evidence for evolution?
Every genetic discovery we actually have today, without bias, points in the direction of evolution. And actually, with genetics, it's much easier, because genetic mutations are very simple. They're traceable. Changes that happen in certain chromosomes, right? And so we can look at the way those chromosomes are today, and we can actually predict with great accuracy where they were yesterday and where they were the day before and so forth. And so a good example that they use here is that of a teacher that built a castle made of Legos in her own classroom. And she has 20 students. And then she asks those students to basically, each one individually, without telling others, would go back to the castle and would either add or remove one of the Lego blocks or leave the castle untouched.
Okay.
So you have to do one of the three. So each student will go, and then they will make some changes or not make any changes in the Lego castle, and she would take a picture. And then the next student will do the same, and then she'd take a picture, and the next student will do the same, and then she'd take a picture. And at the end of the 20th student, she actually brought all 20 pictures, and she placed the 20 pictures, and she asked the class to put the pictures in order, in order of the change. They were all random, but after some effort, it was not very difficult for the class to this was moved here, but it must have been there, because if it wasn't there, then this would have been in its place. Right. So after some effort, they were actually able to establish that this is the order of the picture. So genetic mutations, look the same. We work the logic backwards, and as we do this with every genetic discovery, we realize that it's still pointing in the direction of evolution.
So this must have an incredibly detrimental impact on faith. What are the impacts on faith? Mm-hmm. What are the challenges to faith?
It does have a catastrophic impact if understood in the wrong way. The theory of evolution can have a catastrophic impact on faith. I mean, think about it. It kills teleology completely. Mm-hmm. What is teleology? Teleology is to believe that there is purpose. Right. For the creation, that we are headed in a certain direction, that you have a nose because this nose is supposed to help you smell, mm-hmm. That we are supposed to be headed in the direction of pleasing God and going to heaven, The theory of evolution suggests otherwise. There's no purpose, there's no direction. It is all natural selection, arbitrary directions,
random mutations.
There's no sense of teleology, there's no sense of direction. And it also kills cause completely. We think that God is the cause of the universe, that God is the cause of creation. Frogs exist because God created frogs. Squirrels exist because God created squirrels. Right? Human beings exist because God created human beings and endowed them with responsibility and so forth. Theory of evolution, at least in one reading, suggests that it's just not a cause here. It is all just gradual, random evolution. We moving from one species to the other in God knows which direction.
I want to share with you some of the reactions from people of faith in the face of this. Initially, many will say, look, it's still just a theory. And the scientists actually disagree among each other on this theory.
The way we use the word theory in our casual conversations and the way scientists use it are two different things. Maybe if you're sitting with your friends, sipping some coffee and watching Netflix, and then something moved the curtain and everyone was startled and scared, and somebody said, well, I think it's a jinn that moved the curtain. Someone will say, well, that's your theory.
Right.
My theory is that the cat, was biting on it. This is not a theory. This is just conjecture, right? A theory of science is a hypothesis that was proven, that was established, that was falsifiable, that gained the acceptance of all scientists, and so far there is no alternative to it. And so that is pretty robust to me. Will it change in the future? It could. But until that day comes, I have to revere that scientific perspective today. So it is not a theory in the colloquial sense, and scientists do not disagree, by the way, over evolution. They may have some disagreements on the mechanisms, how natural selection works and how genetic mutations work, but they are not questioning deep time and common ancestry and other premises.
And I know you've said this already, but I just want to be certain. The fossil record, they'll say the fossil record is spotty. It's not spotty, is it?
It's spotty in the sense that not every single box in the fossil record was filled. But it's not spotty in the sense that there's any contradictions. There are no contradictions. Let's say that the table of all fossils has 1,000 boxes, and we only have discovered 250 of them. All 250 point in the direction of evolution. And the more we discover, and every day we discover fossils, we're able to place them neatly in their box, and it still follows the same perspective. So unless David Hume was right, and we cannot rely on the patterns of cause and effect, we would have to stick with evolution for now.
Well, there is, I think, an important point. We recognize, perhaps, that evolution explains the great biodiversity of life on Earth, but evolution does not explain the origin, that moment in which life came to be.
Neither does evolution claim to offer that explanation. Remember what we said earlier, evolution is a theory of science. Science is not interested, at least honest science, not scientism, which is a dogma, but science is not interested in offering comprehensive explanations of the universe and existence and meaning and purpose and life and so forth. It's just has a very particular scope. And that scope is why there is biodiversity in the world, we have a common ancestor, and we've evolved over time. That's pretty much it. Does not make any claims about the origin of life or where that original being, organism, came from. For all practical purposes, it was created by God.
Right.
Evolutionists, honest scientists would have no issue with that. That's a theological, that's a metaphysical question. It's not a question of science.
The problem still remains that it seems clear that believing in evolution as a theory seems to lead many people to atheism.
And not only that, I mean, I've heard people, in our mosque basically attacking evolution as an atheistic paradigm. Right. And attacking people, even criticizing.
Some kind of a conspiracy of atheists.
100%. This is all a conspiracy by atheists, and you should be ashamed of yourself as an imam for believing in these fairy tales. And the thing is, there is a particular reading of evolution that may make it sound atheistic, but essentially it is not. If we read it properly, and if we understand faith properly, there is a way to read it without this naturalistic sort of like atheistic process. There is a different way of reading it, and I will demonstrate that to you.
So let's actually get into this. You shared that there are responses. It's a 100-year-old, a little more than that, science, but it's robust, it's powerful, it's effective, it needs to be taken seriously. There must have been some responses from theologians to these ideas.
And these are fairly modern responses, mostly by a lot of Christian theologians in the 20th century that tried to respond to the crisis of faith that was engendered by evolution. And it's a short list, so let's go through this list. These theological responses from Christianity or from Christian theologians. Number one, there is the so-called young Earth creationism. Young Earth creationism. This is the most conservative of all perspectives. I guess people who are Bible thumpers, they would follow that blindly.
They're committed to a literal reading of the Bible.
100% literal reading of the Bible, which in that understanding, basically evolution as it stands as science is rejected. It's just fairy tales, it's lies. What matters to me is what the Bible says, according to this particular perspective. So they would say that God created the earth and the universe about 10,000 Earth years ago, and that God created Adam about 6,000 years ago, and Adam and Eve were basically in heaven,
right?
And God had a plan for them, and that plan is for them to stay in heaven and for their offspring to stay in heaven, but because they disobeyed God and ate from the fruit and gave in to the seductions of Satan, they were punished. God was so angry that they did this, so they were punished and they were sent back as a punishment to this earth. The flood of Noah was a global event, and there is no deep time, there is no common ancestry. None of this is basically accepted in this particular perspective.
This seems to pit Christianity against science.
100%. 100%. If you follow young Earth creationism, you're basically clashing with science. Right away, and that's why we see a lot of young Christians abandoning Christianity en masse as a result of this particular clash.
So there seems to be no response at all. Are there other responses?
So many Christians decided to mellow down a little bit because of this particular perspective. It was very conservative. So the second one that came to existence is called Old Earth Creationism. And Old Earth Creationism is, like I said, slightly more malleable. They accept deep time. They don't mind the fact that perhaps it took God thousands of years to create the universe.
What about God created the earth in 6 days? How would
they would say that those are not 6 24-hour earth days, but rather the 6 epochs or 6 periods of time. And it's not necessarily our understanding of day to day. They reject common ancestry, and they're still committed to the idea that Adam was sent to this earth, and that Adam is the father of all humans. He does not have any ancestors, and that's that.
And what about other species on Earth? They're also sent by God. Each species
every species was sent by God or created by God directly on its own. So they accept deep time, but they have a problem with common ancestry.
So old, meaning deep time, they're okay with. Creationism, meaning common ancestry, and the mechanisms of evolution, they just reject.
Exactly.
There must be more responses then. There must be other perspectives from the theologians.
So there is the one that I actually think most people would be familiar with is the intelligent design school of thought.
We talked about intelligent design actually. Right?
We talked about this in one of our other conversations, but in intelligent design, this is being presented as an alternative theory of science. It is being presented as an alternative to evolution and not a theological response to it. And actually, in reality, it's not just Christians that support intelligent design. There's a lot of agnostic people that support this theory as well. And so, even though it is still driven by a Christian spirit, but they don't say that in their eyes. They don't make references to the Bible or whatever.
And Muslims too, right?
There's a lot of Muslims actually that subscribe to intelligent design because they're conservative at heart and they want to reject evolution, so they find a haven in intelligent design, basically.
What are the principles of intelligent design?
So intelligent design is accepts deep time. Intelligent design is even willing to accept common ancestry. But what intelligent design basically says is that while the theory of evolution, they disagree with the process of evolution itself. They think it's faulty. They say that the process of evolution, while maybe remotely sufficient to explain how a particular biological function is refined and made efficient over time,
Right.
they
Function
basically,
like movement, perhaps.
exactly. They would argue that the theory of evolution is not sufficient to explain to us how this particular biological function came to existence in the first place. So take the one of the very common examples that they use is the bacterial flagellum. The flagellum gives locomotion to the bacterium, helps the bacteria move. So they say, okay, maybe the flagellum was short, maybe it was not moving efficiently, so evolution can explain why it became efficient over time, but evolution cannot explain to us how this system that is irreducible in its complexity, how it originated in the first place. Was there a point where the bacterium did not have a flagellum, and then the bacteria developed the flagellum? Explain to me how this actually happened.
Right.
Don't just explain to me how the flagellum became effective, but tell me how it came to existence in the first place. So they say because of this irreducible complexity, evolution doesn't work.
No.
Therefore, there has to be a guiding hand of God that basically made this process the way it is.
So they reject the random part of all of this. They reject the natural selection part. Rather, it's the hand of God guiding the entire process
Right,
along.
right. And again, this is a way to unseat the theory of evolution from science in general. So it is their aim to reject deep time and to reject common ancestry. It is not being professed like that.
I see.
If we can kill evolution, everything else will be killed.
Interesting. My issue here is that it just seems like as more and more discoveries are made and more answers are provided by evolution, that there's less and less for them to work with.
And intelligent design seems like the God of the gaps type of argument.
Right.
And so there's holes in the science because we have not discovered the proper explanation yet.
And we just explain them by God.
And so we're gonna explain those holes by God. So wait a second. What if we actually discover a scientific explanation? This will put every man and woman of faith that subscribe to intelligent design or accepted God based on those weak premises, it would put them in jeopardy. And so I personally think that intelligent design still does not work.
Are there any that will purely just accept evolution and make no issues with it whatsoever?
Yeah, they're the evolutionary creationists or the theistic evolutionists. They took the easy way out. They assumed that everything in the Bible is just a metaphor. Adam is a metaphor. The flood of Noah is a metaphor. Heaven and hell is a metaphor. Adam coming to this earth is a metaphor. Satan is a metaphor. All this stuff is just a metaphor. We will just go ahead and accept every single premise of evolution with no question.
Where do you
whatsoever.
decide where the metaphor stops?
Not only that, I mean, we're basically reducing, the scriptures into this just hodgepodge of nonsense.
Right.
It's all just a metaphor. Who gets to interpret the metaphors? Who gets to derive moral lessons from those metaphors? It's just, you can't just say that this is all just a funky story, basically.
One thing that stands out to me here is that you've expressed that these responses, they've come from the theologians. Although Muslims, Christians, Jews, many people of faith will espouse some of these perspectives, they're still coming primarily from the Christian tradition. So I want to know if there are responses and ideas that are coming out of the Islamic tradition in particular, inspired perhaps by the Quran, a different scriptural approach.
And this is a great question, and it's funny because the last 150 years have not been forgiving for Muslims.
Right, it's been a tough time.
It's been a very, very difficult time in the Islamic civilization. You're talking about imperialism, you're talking about Western intervention, you're talking about exploitation, you're talking about slavery, you're talking about installing regimes that are still loyal to imperial powers. You're talking about the complete lack of democracy, economic problems. And so it is entirely fascinating to me that in this difficult ethos that we'd still find great perspectives. In fact, perspectives that have saved both faith and evolution, coming out of Islamic thought and inspired by the Quran.
Now you've got me really excited. I got to hear this. Tell me about these perspectives.
So we basically start our perspectives with what is called Muslim creationists. And Muslim creationists, again, predictably, just like Christian creationists, they completely reject evolution. They want to stick to what I consider to be a more accurate reading of the Bible, actually, not the Quran. They attribute some of the biblical qualities to the evolutionary or to the creation narrative in the Quran in an unjustified fashion. But a lot of Muslim theologians would subscribe to this view.
So can we actually start here? I'm sorry to interrupt, but so tell me, because there's differences here. So what is the Quranic paradigm that we need to operate on so that we understand the responses that come out?
This is a good question. This is a great question, actually, because we can set the groundwork for why the Islamic perspective is slightly different, or not slightly, significantly different from the Christian perspective. And so, number one, the Quran does not commit itself to time frames and years and dates.
Right.
Not a single location will it say, that God created heavens and earth, in this particular time frame, or that Adam came down to earth, in that particular year. Nothing like that. No mention of 10,000 or 6,000, nothing. Number two, no mention in the Quran that the flood of Noah was a global event. Number three, when the Quran talks about the story of creation, it actually suggests that God spoke with the angels first and told them that he plans to put a trustee on earth. To appoint, actually, the word doesn't say, create, it says to appoint a trustee on earth, almost suggesting that trustee was already on earth. And then the Quran also talks about how the angels asked God, why do you appoint someone that has a history of bloodshed and so forth, almost suggesting that there is a history to humanity before Adam.
The angels know something about this thing that's going to be appointed before its creation.
And they were struck by God's decision to appoint someone who has a history of bloodshed, according to the Quran. So this is all extremely interesting. And then when God when God established this man on earth, Adam, it almost in the Quran suggests that Adam was still on earth, that he was in this protected garden, this Jannah, right? He was not in heaven, he was not in paradise, he was right here on earth, and then God gave permission or permitted Satan to enter that garden because Satan was supposed to be the test that Adam needed.
And this is not God being surprised, but rather this is God planning this whole thing out.
From A to Z. And the end product was what God wanted, which is Adam and Eve, being unleashed basically upon the earth in order to establish that human civilization and serve God. All these premises are very, very different from the biblical narrative where God wanted something and then man sinned and then God was like, okay, fine, I need to punish you now because this is not what I want type deal.
Okay, I feel now we're a little more ready to get into some of the other perspectives. So we talked about Muslim creationists. Everything's a metaphor. I think we can leave this aside. Are there more serious perspectives then?
So there's obviously, let's get this out of the way, because we don't like intellectual laziness. There's theistic evolutionists or Muslim evolutionists who again accept evolution 100% without any question, and they assume that all the stories of the Quran are metaphorical. We don't like that. We're not interested in that.
We have our extremes. Creationists, they take everything, from the biblical narrative for some strange reason. And then theistic evolutionists who just say everything is a metaphor. I'm sorry, I mixed those two up earlier. Now, these two extremes seem to not offer any real answers.
Again, there's an intellectual apathy about that I don't appreciate. And so I'm not going to afford it much conversation and much discussion. When someone says all of the Quran, it's just a collection of metaphors, I don't know if I'm willing to accept it. I don't want to accept that. So we will get those out of the way, but now I want to get into more serious perspectives that are really worthy of our consideration. And bear in mind, this is all very new, this is all very young perspectives. The next 50 years are going to witness a tremendous amount of philosophical discussions and writings and publications that will build upon those perspectives, and we will see a breakthrough that I think will reconcile religion with evolution and science in general. But the first one that I want to mention is the so-called human exceptionalism. And human exceptionalism may accept deep time, may accept that the theory of evolution applies perfectly to all non-human creation. They have no problem with genetic mutations. They have no problem with natural selection. They even have no problem with common ancestry, as long as human beings are excluded from that discussion.
A human exceptionalism.
That's why they call it human exceptionalism. You know, if you remove human beings from the planet, then the theory of evolution would apply perfectly to everything else. But human beings were placed on this planet miraculously by a choice of God, basically.
This is compelling. This is compelling, but it does seem to suspend the science, particularly when it comes to human beings. But it's okay with all other creation.
It's still powerful, and it still works. They're basically saying that there is a limitation of science, and that limitation of science is to basically explain how non-human life existed. But when it comes to man, as people of faith, we have to accept that this is a miracle that came from God. And the argument actually uses a pretty powerful metaphor. It uses the dominoes metaphor. Okay, so if you have sometimes they put the dominoes pieces like this,
right,
and then you push the first piece, and then a domino effect takes place. So he says that at the time when a humanoid was supposed to evolve and to come to existence, at that time, God suspended the process and He sent human beings.
Right, right.
In a miraculous fashion.
Yeah.
And again, they do this in order to reconcile their literal direct reading of the Quran with the theory of evolution. So they don't want to reject evolution with its entirety, but they can't accept that the human being was subject to the evolutionary process, because this in their minds would contradict with the idea of creation.
Right, right. So what are there's more perspectives, because I think we still have to find a way to explain Neanderthals, we have to explain Heidelbergensis, etc. So are there other theories, are there other perspectives?
Yes, and there is one that I think, in my personal opinion, is much more powerful than human exceptionalism, which is Adamic exceptionalism.
Right.
They accept all of the premises of the evolutionary theory. They accept deep time. They accept common ancestry. They accept genetic mutations, natural selection. They even accept that humanoids, human being-like species,
Homo
sapien-like species existed on Earth, and they were the product of the evolutionary process, perfectly fine. The only exception to all of this was not human beings,
Adamic exceptionalism,
but Adam himself.
Okay.
Adam and only Adam. Adam is the only member of that process that was placed miraculously on Earth.
Right.
Everyone else was subject to the process of evolution. So for all practical purposes, Adam and perhaps Eve, they got married, and then they gave rise to children, and those children mingled with the offspring of the other humanoids that already existed on Earth. But all the pure non-Adamic
lineages,
right, they withered and they went extinct over time, which makes it that where today all human beings, one way or the other, in a pure form or an impure form, we're all descendants of Adam.
Yeah, this is incredible, and I think I would feel very satisfied with this. I think we can take this perspective and move with it.
It is actually a good perspective. It's robust in the sense that it explains certain things that we've always had an issue with. Like, for example, if Adam and Eve were the first humans, and there was absolutely no other humans, the only way for them to have procreated and for their kids and their family to have grown is through these weird incestuous relationships that must have taken place between the boys and the girls. And there is nothing in the Quran, there is nothing in the prophetic hadith that pointed us in that direction. Some companions use that as an opinion, trying to understand to explain it. But I've always had an issue with incestuous relationships. But if you take Adamic exceptionalism, it actually opens the door for the sons and daughters of Adam to have gotten married to all the other members of the other humanoid species. And it also opens the door for the notion that Adam is a prophet, and he must have preached to somebody that is not just his own kids. So I like that. What I don't like about Adamic exceptionalism, however, is that it still tries to uphold a biological theory of science while suspending its impact on only one member of that species.
Right.
That is way too metaphysical to mingle into this process.
Is there anything that answers this? Is there any perspective that gives us a complete answer without any suspension of the science?
I don't know if it's complete, but it's one that may offer some guidance in that regard. And it is the one that we call Adamic intellectual endowment.
Mm-hmm. As opposed to Adamic exceptionalism, Adamic intellectual endowment.
So there's still some exceptionalism about Adam,
sure,
but not a biological exceptionalism, rather a metaphysical intellectual exceptionalism. And in this particular perspective, Adam existed on earth. Adam had siblings. Mm-hmm. Adam had parents. Mm-hmm. He existed in a community of humanoids. They were kind of wilder.
Right.
They had human qualities, but they also had beast qualities. They hurt others. They were committed a lot of injustices against each other. But they had the seed of consciousness. They were on their way. And then God, according to this particular perspective, endowed Adam himself, hence the endowment, with self-consciousness, endowed him with moral responsibility, with accountability, made him into a prophet, basically. Mm-hmm. And commissioned him to preach to the earth and to preach to other people, how to worship God and how to make good and moral choices and how to stop being animals and to now become who you're meant to be, and that is the ruling class over all the other species, to be on top of the food chain and to deserve that morally as human beings. That is basically the Adamic intellectual endowment.
It's an incredible perspective, and I think it's amazing in that in the areas where it matters to the evolutionary biologists, there is no need to suspend anything of the science. But I still need to ask, where is this coming from? From the Islamic perspective, what is it that's supporting all of this?
There is a robust reading of the Quran that may actually put us in that direction. Number one, as I said earlier, God basically selected Adam. In the Quran, it says that multiple times.
He uses that language specifically, yeah?
He uses the language specifically that God selected Adam. And in the other, you have to select Adam from amongst other human beings. Mm-hmm. It can't just be selected him, out of trees. Mm-hmm. It can't be selected him out of air or nothing, right? Also, when God talks to the angels and he says, I will make a man my trustee on earth, suggests that that man was already there. It doesn't say created, it just said made. Also, the response of the angels was quite fascinating. When they said to God, why would you appoint someone that has this history of bloodshed? Almost alluding to the fact that they are already familiar with the ways of man from before Adam. And the ways of man were and perhaps continue to be really
mischievous and bloodshed.
Terrifying, exactly, without that self-consciousness and that morality and that understanding of God. Mm-hmm. There's also verses in the Quran where God talks about the order of creation. So he says, I created humans, and then he says, I created jinn, and then he says, I created man. Literally.
He created Adam.
Adam, in this order, right? So I created man, I created jinn, and then I created Adam.
Right. This is the Quran.
And uses the word then in the Quran, which is quite fascinating. So there's bits and pieces here and there in the Quran that actually point us in that direction, and I find that to be a perspective that accepts evolution as science, that does not insert something in the evolutionary process and somehow assume that there was a biological exception for that particular being, but also opens the door for a metaphysical understanding, of why we came to existence as human beings today. It respects the fossil record, it respects the fundamentals of the Quran and the scriptures, and it makes it where you can, as a man of faith, can accept evolution as science and still accept God as a creator.
Just to clarify, what exactly is it or what might it be that Adam was intellectually endowed with?
He was endowed with free will. He was endowed with the ability to make decisions for himself. He was endowed with a sense of accountability. He was endowed with knowledge that will help him navigate the earth. The word that the Quran uses, al-asma'a kullaha, the names of all things, right? So all the knowledge that he needed to be God's trustee on earth was given to him at that time of his appointment as a prophet.
Imam, I really appreciate the sincerity of this reading of the Quranic perspective, and I'm just incredibly excited that in 45 minutes, or maybe a little over because of the necessity of so, we were able to resolve a 100 year long conflict that has been raging on between faith and science. Thank you so much. This was incredible.
I appreciate the time. Thank you.
To further conversations.
Absolutely.